Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into one of history's strangest rabbit holes, the world of medieval royalty, and what happens when you keep marrying your cousins for a few too many generations. Spoiler alert, it's not good. You probably won't survive this journey genetically speaking, but it is fascinating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, what city are you listening from tonight and what time is it where you are? Drop in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: the crackling of fire in a stone hall, flicker of candlelight catching on silver goblets, and a young noble woman in velvet robes being introduced to her future husband, who is also casually her cousin or her uncle or her nephew. Welcome to the elite world of medieval European aristocracy, where bloodlines mattered more than biology and love had absolutely nothing to do with marriage. The term inbred carries a punch today, but in the medieval context, it was strategy. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and the Trastammeras didn't just intermarry for fun, they did it to hoard power, land, and legitimacy. If you marry your cousin, you don't lose any castles. If you marry a foreigner, suddenly someone else is raising your heir in a rival kingdom. So the logic was clear, even if the consequences weren't yet. Over generations, that logic led to genetic whirlpools that birthed some of the most fascinating and tragic figures in European history. You're going to meet women tonight who were daughters of double first cousins, nieces married to their uncles, and sisters married off to their first cousin. Once removed, these aren't just mathematical absurdities. They were real women with complicated lives, deep loyalties, and sometimes shocking symptoms of what happens when your DNA plays the royal version of musical chairs. We'll visit stone palaces in Spain, gloomy castles in Austria, and glittering courts in France. In the Low Countries, you'll watch as empires rise and fall around these women, many of whom, let's be honest, never got a say in a matter. Take the Habsburg, for instance, the undisputed champions of European inbreeding. Their family tree isn't so much a tree as a wreath. They built a global empire on marriages, each one drawing the family net tighter until it practically strangled itself. And while we'll spend time with some of the more infamous male Habsburgs later, it's the women who carried the generational load, both politically and genetically. These women were the mothers of kings and queens, the breeders of empire, and the unfortunate bearers of some truly unlucky traits. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs, the Capetians of France, the Trastammeras of Spain, and even the Plantagenets of England dipped their toes in the same shallow gene pool. The goal was always the same: consolidate claims, prevent civil war, and lock down dynastic legitimacy. But with that came feuds, forced marriages, and a trail of noble women who spent their lives navigating a world where family meant everything and meant way too much. What's wild is how obvious some of the side effects became over time: elongated jaws, fertility issues, recurring mental illness, stillbirths, and strangely shaped skulls pop up again and again in royal lineages. Yet nobody seemed all that eager to change course. Even the church, which technically forbade incestuous marriages past a certain degree, made exceptions for royals. The Pope would often grant a dispensation, basically a holy permission slip, for yet another cousin marriage, as long as it kept the peace. Here's the kicker: modern geneticists have actually studied some of these lineages and confirmed what those medieval matchmakers refused to see: inbreeding coefficients. Yes, that's a thing. Are measurable, and several royal offspring had scores comparable to the children of sibling unions. One of the highest ever recorded, Charles II of Spain, whose tragic tale we'll save for the end. But spoiler, he couldn't chew food properly, couldn't walk without help, and likely had the mental development of a 5-year-old. And yes, he had a lot of aunts and uncles who were also his cousins, of course. Not every royal woman with a tangled ancestry suffered overtly. Some were brilliant rulers, effective diplomats, and adored queens. One of the fringe debates among historians today is just how much inbreeding actually influenced personality or mental stability. For example, was Joanna the Mad of Castile actually insane, or just caught in a brutal political trap where her erratic behavior was exaggerated to keep her from ruling? Was her daughter's melancholy a symptom of family genetics, or the result of a lifetime trapped between power and duty? This kind of question pops up a lot when you start pulling threads on these women's lives. How much was nature and how much was nurture? These women weren't just passive figures. They were queens, regents, and mothers shaping the future of empires. Some of them ruled directly, others ruled through their sons or husbands, and they all bore the burden of dynastic duty in a way their male counterparts didn't. A prince might go off to war or drink himself to death, but a princess was expected to marry whomever the crown required and produce heirs no matter how many. Miscarriages, deformities, or depressions came along the way. In the next sections, we'll meet specific women whose stories exemplify this strange intersection of politics, genetics, and deeply personal struggle. You'll follow Isabella of Habsburg as her bloodline loops inward, Joanna of Castle as her sanity is questioned, and Eloanina of Portugal as she marries her own uncle to cement imperial power. Along the way, we'll sprinkle in facts you've never heard before, like which queen's jaw had to be redrawn in official portraits, or which princess was technically her husband's great aunt. So buckle up gently. The next few hours might just make you grateful for your boring, unroyal DNA. So let's head straight into the tangled tapestry of inbred nobility with a woman who is practically the poster child for what happens when your entire family tree folds in on itself like an origami disaster. Isabella of Habsburg. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be the result of multiple generations of cousin marriages, well, meet Isabella. She doesn't just belong to the Habsburg dynasty. She is the Habsburg dynasty rolled up into one velvet draped, highly ceremonial genetic loop. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castle, aka Joanna the Mad, who we'll meet properly in the next section. For now, just note that Isabella's parents were both grandchildren of the same royal couple, John XIII of Aragon and Isabella the First of Castile. That means Isabella's family tree was already bending awkwardly and on itself from the moment she cried her first baby cry in Brussels, and by the time she reached marrying age around 13, because of course she did. Her value wasn't about her smile or her charm, it was all about the blood, that Habsburg blood. She was married off to Christian II of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a man described by contemporaries as Muriel, which is a polite way of saying he was probably a bit of a nightmare. Their marriage was political, like every marriage of the age, but it also had an edge of desperation. Christian needed allies, and the Habsburgs needed influence in Scandinavia. Isabella was the literal body through which that influence would flow. Her uterus was now official royal policy. Here's where it gets complicated, because of course it does. Christian wasn't exactly stable. He was charming at times, yes, and he clearly liked Isabella, but he also had a favorite mistress, Diverka, Sigbrit Data, whom he refused to abandon even after. Marrying the Habsburg princess Diva was low-born, not even nobility, and Isabella had to sit there in her Danish castle pregnant with the future, while her husband prayed his mistress around court like a new horse that must have stung even for someone raised to accept political marriages as part of the royal gig. But Isabella held her own. She bore Christian 6 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, which in itself was a miracle given the gene pool and the general medieval lack of sanitation. One of her son, John, would have a short life, but her daughter Doratha would go on to marry another cousin. Naturally, Isabella's influence at court grew, particularly after Dev died. Suddenly, maybe from poisoned cherries, maybe not. The truth is murky, and so are the rumors. Some whispered that Isabella or her allies had a hand in it, but there's no hard proof, just a sudden vacancy in the royal mistress role, and a queen who stepped up into real power. And yet the genetic weight of her ancestry didn't disappear. Isabella herself suffered from bouts of illness that some historians now think might have been linked to hemophilia or a similar inherited disorder. She died young, just 24 years old. The official cause of sudden illness, the medieval catch-all term for anything from tuberculosis to a stroke to well-inherited genetic dysfunctions we can't pin down from the comfort of our modern armchairs. A quirky fact about Isabella's brief life: she was fluent in at least 5 languages thanks to her Habsburg upbringing. These weren't, I can ask where the bathroom is, skills either she could hold diplomatic conversations in Latin, Castilian, Flemish, French, and German. Her letters reveal a sharp mind, a touch of sarcasm, and a keen understanding of the politics around her. She wasn't just a vessel for babies. She was aware of the chessboards and moved across it as much as her gender allowed. Now here's where scholars still butt heads. Was Isabella a victim of her family's obsession with purity, or simply unlucky and a dangerous age? Some point to her children's weak health and her own early death as clear signs of genetic fragility. Others argue that early mortality was just part of the course in the 16th century, even for royals. And while that's true to an extent, the Habsburgs' increasingly closed breeding circles make the debate harder. To ignore what's not debated is this: Isabella's children carried forward even more concentrated royal blood, making the next generation of Habsburgs even more genetically enclosed. Her grandson Maximilian II would marry his first cousin, and their children, well, let's just say their jawlines could cut glass. And not in a good way. One eerie thing about Isabella's life is how quiet it feels in retrospect. She's one of those queens you rarely hear about, unless you go looking. No big wars, no grand scandals, no famous paintings. And yet her DNA echoes all through European history. Her blood ran in the veins of emperors, kings, and doomed heirs of power in this world can be measured by legacy. Then Isabella was more powerful than most of the men around her. She just didn't get a crown to show it. You almost want to go back in time and whisper to her through the veil of centuries on, hey, maybe skip that cousin, maybe tell your daughter to try someone new, like someone not related. But you know she couldn't. That was the game. and she played it as well as anyone with her last name could, from the quiet courts of Denmark to the loud echoes of dynastic strategy. Isabella of Habsburg's life is one of the clearest examples of what happens when royalty values family ties. Just a bit too much, she didn't live long, but what she passed on would shape Europe for the next 2 centuries, and a lot of those results weren't exactly healthy. Now that you've met Isabella of Habsburg, it's time to step even deeper into the foggy Gothic corridors of royal heredity and meet her mother, Joanna of Castile, or as she's better known in the history books, Joanna the Mad. You've probably heard the nickname before, maybe you picture her wandering a castle barefoot, mumbling to herself, or clutching her dead husband's coffin like a morbid romantic. And yes, some of that actually happened. But the full story of Joanna, it's less madness, more tragedy, with a generous sprinkle of dynastic pressure, and of course a heavy dose of concentrated family genetics. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Spain's power coupled the Catholic monarchs who unified the Spanish kingdoms and sponsored a certain Christopher Columbus. Their marriage was the ultimate political power move, and there they wanted their children to follow suit. Joanna was their third child, smart, reserved, and devout, with eyes that reportedly smoldered when she was angry. But there was one catch: her family tree already had that classic royal kink. Her parents were second cousins, not a terrible start by medieval standards, but the signs of internal looping were starting to flicker as a young woman. Joanna was shipped off to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome. Yes, that's literally what they called him. And yes, it was mostly for politics. Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian F and Mary of Burgundy. And this union was meant to forge a powerful European alliance. But unlike many arranged royal marriages, Joanna and Philip were weirdly into each other, like passionately, obsessively into each other. At first, the kind of chemistry that raised eyebrows at court, you might think. Oh, that's sweet. But this is a bedtime history, not a fairy tale. So you know what's coming. Philip was charming, ambitious, and very aware of his own good looks. Joanna, deeply in love, became intensely jealous, especially once Philip began openly cheating on her. She would reportedly scream, throw things, and demand to know the names of his mistress's court. Rumor had it that she once attacked a lady in waiting with scissors over a flirtatious glance. Was she mentally ill, or just a woman pushed to the edge in a world where her power was always second to her husband's pleasure? Things only got worse when her mother, Queen Isabella, died and Joanna became Queen of Castile. On paper, this should have made her one of the most powerful women in Europe, but Philip wasn't having it. He tried to muscle in as king, claiming Joanna was too unstable to rule. Her father, Ferdinand, did the same thing. Both men wanted control over Castile, and both used Joanna's supposed madness as an excuse to take it from her. What followed was a slow, relentless campaign to paint her as unfit, a narrative that stuck partly because it was convenient and partly because Joanna did start to show signs of emotional collapse after Philip's sudden death in 1506. He reportedly drank cold water after playing a vigorous game of ball, and it shocked his system, which, yes, sounds fake. Joanna's grief became extreme. This is where the famous coffin story comes, and she had his body embalmed, refused to bury it for years, and traveled with the casket across Castile, stopping at monasteries and demanding prayers for his soul, some say. She opened the coffin periodically to gaze at him. Others claim She refused to allow any women near it, fearing they might seduce his corpse. Okay, that part does edge in a mental illness territory, but hold on, this is where modern historians start citing the narrative. Yes, Joanna's behavior was eccentric, even disturbing, but was it madness or grief weaponized by power? Hungry men she had just lost her husband was being isolated from her children and had everyone around her gaslighting her into thinking she was unwell. Even her attendants were under orders to keep her under control. When you're locked away in a cold castle with no friends, no allies, and a lifetime of dynastic expectation weighing on you, madness might just be the only way out. Here's the genetic kicker: Joanna's parents were related, sinned, and her husband was her second cousin, their child, Isabella, from the last section, was part of a lineage that was now officially swirling in on itself. You can track Joanna's bloodline straight down to Charles II of Spain, whose family tree looks like a family tumbleweed. Also, here's a fringe fact you're not going to hear in most textbooks. Some 16th century doctors actually believe that uterine misalignment caused female madness, as in they thought her womb had literally traveled to her head. No joke. One account from a Spanish physician describes Joanna as being afflicted with a wandering womb, which they thought caused her hysteria. The solution: herbal compresses, prayer, and once wait for it, a suggested exorcism. Modern scholars love to debate whether Joanna really had what we now call bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or whether she was a victim of socio-political abuse. One particularly interesting theory suggests she may have had a form of post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by constant betrayal and the deaths of her children. Because yes, while she was confined in Tortoise for nearly 50 years, her children died one by one, usually far from her. She was denied the chance to raise them, see them, or even grieve them properly. And yet through all this, she remained technically Queen of Castile. Her signature still sealed royal decrees. Her presence still mattered, if only as a figurehead, and the dynasty rolled on through her blood and her heartbreak. So what's the takeaway here? Joanna wasn't just a mad one, she was the product of strategic inbreeding, the porn of rival male egos, and maybe, just maybe, a woman who saw too much and cracked under the pressure. But her legacy didn't crack. Her children would go on to shape Europe, and her story remains one of the most haunting examples of what happens when you mix too much royal blood with too little compassion. Next, we'll meet another woman from a royal bloodline tangled in its own reflection, Blanche of Castile, who finds herself caught in the push-pull of French and Spanish dynasties. But first, let Joanna linger in your mind for a moment, alone in a fortress. Her world shrinking, her love unbared, her name etched in a history, not for what she did, but for what they said. She was now. Your eyes drift toward another castle corridor lit by a flickering rushlight and echoing with footsteps that trace centuries-old ambitions. Tonight, we cross the Pyrenees into a tale not quite as gothic as Joanna's, but every bit as woven with domestic pressure and genetic deja vu. Meet Blanche of Castile. She doesn't get the kind of historical spotlight that queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de Bast. But don't let that fool you. Blanche was a linchpin in one of Europe's most tangled noble nets, and like many royal women of the time, she was born into a family already looping back and on itself. Blanche came into the world in 1188, the daughter of King Alfonso VI of Castile And Ellalinina of England, yes, that Ellalinina, daughter of Henry the Sind and Ellalaner of Aquitaine, that made Blanche a granddaughter of two powerful dynasties. Her blood was a potent blend of English Plantagenet ambition and Spanish Trastamara pride. It also meant her family tree had already begun its slow spiral, because the Castilian and French royal lines weren't shy about marrying cousins. When it kept power close at the age of 12, Blanche was sent off to France to marry Louis, the son of King Philip II. But hang on, she wasn't actually the original choice. The French had originally wanted her sister Urraca. But when a last-minute switch-up happened, one that scholars still squint at with. Suspicion Blanche was plucked instead. Why the change, some say Urraca was too Spanish, or that Blanche simply had a better temperament. Others hint at something less flattering. Urraca may have shown signs of inherited instability, and the French crown didn't want to risk it. Whether that's true or just a smear campaign cloaked in diplomacy, we'll never know for sure. Blanc married Louis VI of France in 1200 and quickly proved herself far more than a ceremonial wife. When Louis became king, she stepped up not just in courtly presence, but as a political force. And when he died in 126, leaving their son Louis Van, later St. Louis, as a boy king of 12, Blanche didn't blink. She declared herself a regent and ran France like a queen who'd been waiting a whole life for the chance. And she had, while other women were sewing tapestries and birthing heirs, Blanche was drafting treaties, intimidating barons, and keeping the fragile Capetian hold on France intact. But here's the part we're here for. Blanche's bloodline, she and Louis VI were third cousins, close enough that the church had to grant a dispensation for the marriage. It wasn't exactly scandalous by the standards of the day, but it was part of a growing pattern of dynasties interweaving themselves so tightly that marriage options became less about finding a match and more about finding someone you weren't related to. And with Blanche, that issue just kept compounding. She had 13 children, though only a few survived to adulthood. Louis the Ninth, of course, became a king and later a saint, but scholars have often pointed out that several of his siblings had health problems or died young. Common, yes, but statistically higher than normal, even for the time. One theory suggests Blanche and Louise's shared Plantagenet ancestry may have carried some form of inherited immune weakness, though this remains speculative. Another quirky rumor that Blanche was so obsessed with keeping her son pure that she discouraged him from sleeping with his wife. Some even whispered that she had an unnatural attachment to him, though that's probably more medieval gossip than reliable record. Still, it speaks to the way Blanche was viewed: intense, commanding, and always just a bit unsettling. You don't get to rule as a woman in the 13th century without people throwing a little suspicion your way, especially if you're doing it successfully. And Blanche was successful. She not only held France together during her son's minority, but she later returned to regency when he left for crusade. For years, she governed with a stern hand and a sharp eye, navigating rebellions, famine, and papal politics with barely a stumble. But the toll on her family and possibly her children's health remained an undercurrent. One scholarly debate that's still alive today: was Blanche herself subtly affected by the genetic tightrope her family walked? While there's no record of physical deformity or obvious illness, some letters suggest she suffered from extreme migraines and recurring melancholia. That lovely medieval catch-all that could mean depression, hormonal imbalance, or something passed along the family line like a well-polished heirloom. There's also a fascinating detail from her death in 1252. Reportedly, she collapsed on the way to a convent and lingered in pain for days, murmuring prayers and hallucinating visions of saints. Some modern readers interpret this as spiritual ecstasy. Others less romantically wonder if it was a stroke or hereditary neurological condition. Again, no definitive answers, just a woman's final days shrouded in mystery much like her life. Here's a lesser-known fact. Blanche was one of the first French queens to actively sponsor universities. She supported the development of theology studies at the University of Paris and personally funded monastic libraries. So yeah, while she was wrangling rebellious nobles and managing her emotionally complicated son, she was also quietly helping launch the European intellectual Renaissance. No big deal. You can almost imagine her today ghosting through a candle-lit library and RU muttering Latin aphorisms and glaring disapprovingly at anyone making noise. Not mad, not tragic, just tired and probably still running things from beyond the grave. So while Blanche of Castile isn't the most inbred woman on our list, she represents an early example of how medieval power marriages began to fold back in on themselves, and how royal women burdened with bloodlines and expectations carved out their legacies anyway, sometimes with iron fists hidden beneath. Silken Sleeves next will travel to Portugal, where Evelina of Portugal finds herself pulled into a family dynamic so twisted that her groom shares not just her family name, but her uncle's face. Hope you're ready for that one. And now, let's take a soft step into the warm Iberian air of the 15th century, where stone palaces glint beneath the Portuguese sun and royal carriages creak beneath the weight of more than just gold and silk. They carry dynastic expectations, ancient rivalries, and a kind of family ties that require both a wedding and a DNA test. Tonight's central figure, Eleanor of Portugal. If you're already cringing at the thought of an uncle becoming a husband, congratulations, you're awake and paying attention. Because yes, that actually happened, and it wasn't even considered all that weird at the time. Evelina was born in 1434 into the house of Aves, a branch of the Portuguese royal family known for its tangled roots and political ambitions. She was one of several children born to King Edward of Portugal and Evelina of Aragon, which already made her a prize in the international marriage market. Her siblings included future kings and queens, but Evelina's path would take her north into the chilly reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, where her marriage was supposed to cement a powerful alliance. What no one talked about at the wedding feast was how closely she and her groom were already related her husband. Emperor Frederick III was not only her cousin, but he was technically her uncle through marriage lines so convoluted they practically form a Celtic knot. But of course, inbreeding among royals wasn't just tolerated, it was the norm. Marrying a close relative wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. If it kept the throne within the family and prevented rival claims, then so be it. The Pope would give a little nod of approval, issue a dispensation, and another cousinly kiss would seal the fate of another generation. Evelina's wedding to Frederick was awkward from the start. She traveled to Italy for the ceremony, which was delayed several times because Frederick, ever the cautious emperor, was reluctant to commit. He reportedly didn't even meet her until the actual wedding day, and his first reaction was, "She's prettier than her portrait, so yay for low expectations." The wedding finally went through in 1452, and Elelonina became Holy Roman Empress, one of the most powerful titles in Christendom. But power doesn't guarantee happiness. Their marriage was strained. Elelonina, raised in the more relaxed and artistically rich courts of Portugal, found Frederick's court cold, rigid, and depressingly frugal. He was obsessed with bureaucracy and finances. She wanted music, color, and life. Letters from the time hinted her frustration. She reportedly once said that her husband would rather count coins than kiss his wife. Yikes. Meanwhile, Frederick found Elelonina too emotional, too passionate. How this for irony, too foreign. Still, they did their dynastic duty and had 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Among them was Maximilian Theus, who would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary, yet another cousin, solidifying the Habsburg rise to power. But Elelonina, she struggled. Her health began to deteriorate, possibly from the strain of pregnancy's long cold, winters, and the slow suffocation of life with a man who treated her more like an economic advisor than a wife. Now, let's talk about the genetics. Elelonina and Frederick's shared bloodline was already layered with intermarriage. Both had ancestors from the Aragons and Biondian houses, and their union concentrated that blood further. The result, their son Maximilian inherited the family jaw, the early hints of the legendary Habsburg jaw that would come to symbolize centuries of royal inbreeding. But that's just the visible sign. What historians whisper about more quietly is the mental health issues, miscarriages, and the faint echo of autoimmune disorders that crop up again and again in the family line. A quirky side note, Elelonina is one of the few medieval empresses whose voice survives. In her own hand, some of her letters to her brother King Alfonso V of Portugal still exist in them. She vents about court life, the isolation she feels, and how much she misses home. There's something hauntingly modern about her complaints. She talks about not having anyone to confide in, about feeling like an outsider, even in her own family, and about the cold halls of the imperial court that seem to suck the life out of her. If there's a ghost pacing through those stone corridors at Growl or Vina Node, it's probably Elelonina, still homesick and misunderstood. Here's where Scully debate still flickers. Was Elelonina simply a mismatched wife trapped in a political alliance, or was she experiencing the early toll of genetic accumulation? Her declining health has been attributed to everything from tuberculosis to depression, but some researchers suggest she may have inherited a form of porphyria, a blood disorder linked to noble lineages, and sometimes mistaken for madness or hysteria. There's no conclusive evidence, just hints in her letters and descriptions from court chroniclers about her pale sensitivity to light and frequent fits of melancholy. She died young, just 32 years old officially it was. Illness, but most agree it was a long and painful slide into frailty, worsened by the years of emotional neglect and probably some good old-fashioned medieval medical malpractice. Frederick didn't even attend her funeral. He stayed behind, reportedly busy with court documents. That tells you everything, doesn't it? And yet Elelonina's legacy looms large. Her son Maximilian would go on to shape European history, expanding the Habsburg Empire and marrying his own relatives with relentless efficiency. Eloanina's blood would flow through the veins of emperors and queens, carrying with it both the strength of her Iberian heritage and the weaknesses of a gene pool that had been stirred far too little. What stands out most about Eloanina is the quiet sadness that threads through her life. She wasn't mad like Joanna. She wasn't iron-willed like Blanche. She was soft-edged romantic and ultimately too human for the cold machinery of imperial politics, but she played her part. She gave birth to the next dynasty, and that for a royal woman of her time was the highest and most unforgiving form of success. Next, we'll meet Margaret of Austria, Eloanina's granddaughter, and one of the sharpest political minds of her day, raised in a family so genetically compact that holiday dinners probably required a family tree cheat sheet just to figure out who to kiss on the cheek. Now, imagine this: you're a young girl born into a labyrinth of castles, cousins, and kings, and before you've even lost your baby teeth, you're already being discussed like a valuable chess piece. That was Margaret of Austria, and yes, she's technically the granddaughter of Eloanina of Portugal, but by this point the Habsburg family line has twisted itself into such tight knots that even the family dog might have qualified for a noble title. Margaret grew up in the very eye of this dynastic storm, trained to smile, curtsy, and marry strategically. But what makes her stand out in this parade of inbred nobility is that she didn't just survive the system, she mastered it. Born in 1480 in Brussels, Margaret was the daughter of Maximilian the First, the Holy Roman Emperor, and son of, you guessed it, Frederick and Eloanina. Her mother, Mary of Burgundy, died young after falling off a horse, which left Margaret motherless by age 2. Right out of the cradle, she was seen not as a grieving child, but as a dynastic prize. Her father immediately betrothed her to the French Duke Charles, who was barely older than her and would later become King Charles. At the ripe old age of 3, Margaret was shipped off to the French court to be raised as the future Queen of France. As far as political gambits go, was classic Habsburg: start young, lock in alliances early, and hope nobody dies in the meantime. But things didn't go according to plan. When Charles reached marrying age, he ditched Margaret and instead married, and of Brittany, a major territorial win, but a total slap in the face to the girl who had grown up in his palace. Margaret, still a teenager, was unceremoniously returned to her father, heartbroken and politically bruised. If she cried on the way home, no one wrote it down. But from this point on, she started building a different kind of power. She was married off again, this time to John of Castellar, to the Spanish throne. Yes, that same Spanish royal line that came from her own tangled ancestry. Once again, the genes looped together like tangled Christmas lights. Margaret and John were cousins several times over, connected through both Habsburg and Trastamara lines. Their marriage was brief. John died within a year, probably from tuberculosis, though rumors of poison floated around, because, well, medieval courts loved a little conspiracy with their mourning Margaret, now widowed before age 20. It might have been expected to fade into the background and quietly become a nun or a melancholy dowager. But nope, not Margaret. She returned to the Habsburg court and slowly, steadily carved out a political identity so sharp it could slice through stained glass. She never remarried, instead dedicating herself to politics and governance, eventually becoming governor of the Netherlands twice. That's right, a royal woman governing a powerful economic hub while maintaining diplomatic relations with France, Spain, and England. And she did all while wearing gowns so stiff with embroidery they could stand on their own. Now, let's not forget the inbreeding elephant in the room, Margaret's entire family was deep into cousin territory, her father Maximilian. The first had married his cousin. Her brother Philip the Handsome would marry Joanna of Kassel, who was also their cousin. Margaret herself had married her cousin. The Habsburg family tree by this point resembled a Mobius strip, and you can start to see the effects. Her brother Philip died young of fever, and his son Charles V would inherit so much consolidated genetic baggage that his chin could be spotted from orbit. But Margaret, she didn't seem to suffer physically from the family's favored marital policies. She was sharp, healthy for most of her life, and politically astute. Some historians point to her as a rare example of a Habsburg woman who defied the decline. Still, her life wasn't untouched by the consequences as guardian of her niece and nephew Charles F. and his siblings. She was intimately aware of the psychological and physical toll the family bloodlines were starting to take. One of her nieces, Elenina of Austria, would go on to marry yet another cousin. Another Catherine would marry King John. Three of Portugal, her double first cousin Margaret, arranged many of these marriages herself, fully aware of the genetics involved, but also boxed in by political necessity. A quirky fact: Margaret had a pet monkey named Barb and was famously fond of her collection of books, tapestries, and art. She was also an avid letter writer. Her correspondence with her cousin, the famed humanist Erasmus, reveals a woman of intelligence, wit, and occasional dry sarcasm. In one letter, she describes a courtier as having the charm of a leaky wine barrel, which frankly should be embroidered on a pillow. Scholars still debate just how powerful Margaret really was. Some say she was merely a figurehead executing the plans of her male relatives. Others argue she was the puppet master, subtly influencing the direction of Habsburg Europe from behind the velvet curtain. There's evidence for both. What's certain is that kings wrote to her for advice. Ambassadors reported to her, and her policies kept the Netherlands relatively stable during years of upheaval. Not bad for someone who'd been used like a pawn in two failed marriages. Before her 20th birthday, Margaret died in 1530 at age 50 from complications after stepping on a nail, proving that not even imperial savvy can save you from tetanus. But her death was deeply mourned. Even Erasmus wrote in grief, saying that Europe had lost one of its finest minds, not one of its finest women. Mind you, its finest minds. High praise from a Renaissance intellectual in Margaret of Austria stands as a sharp contrast to so many of the tragic wilting flowers that populate royal family trees. She may have been born from the same inbred tangle, but she bloomed on her own terms. She arranged the very marriages that would further twist her family's genetic fabric, yes, but not out of cruelty or blindness. She was playing the only game allowed to her, and she played it better than most. Next, we'll head into England to meet one of Margaret's future sisters-in-law by marriage, Catherine of Aragon, another princess of Castile, another victim of the cousins stacking, and the woman who would eventually face off with Henry VII in a marital battle for the ages. You hear the clink of golden goblets, the rustle of silk skirts, the echo of Latin prayers drifting through a stone chapel lit by thin beams of morning light. You're in England now, early 16th century, just before everything goes off the rails. And at the center of this poised, polished moment is a young woman with a serene smile and a bloodline more knotted than a sailor's test. Catherine of Aragon. You probably know her as Henry VII's first wife, the one he dumped for in Berlin, sparking as a religious firestorm and beheading spree. But before all that drama, Catherine had already lived a life that reads like a dynastic instruction manual titled How to Marry Your Cousins and Lose Everything Anyway. Catherine was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the same power couple we met. Earlier, when Joanna the Mad was crying into her embroidery, Catherine was the afterthought baby born right around the time Spain was finishing up its reconquest and evicting the last Muslim rulers from Granada. So she entered the world at a triumphant, bloody moment. Her parents, now the united Catholic monarchs, their children purebred, dynastic gold. Now, let's take a peek at that family tree. Shall we? Her parents were second cousins, part of the Trastamara dynasty that had already been intermarrying with each other and with various branches of French, Portuguese, and Burgundian nobility. That meant Catherine had Habsburg blood on both sides, as well as Plantagenet blood. Through earlier generations, her double cousin status wasn't some weird exception. It was practically a feature. In fact, Catherine was pre-packaged for royal marriage, bilingual, pious, educated, and genetically engineered to match up with every major ruling house in Europe at. Just 3 years old, she was promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales' son. Of Henry VIII of England by age 15, she was shipped off to a cold Tudor court with her dowry, her ladies-in-waiting, and more Spanish lace than an entire convent. The wedding happened in 1501, a grand ceremony that was equal parts diplomatic showcase and political insurance. Arthur was the future king, and Catherine, a Spanish bride, was expected to sew Spain and England together at the hip a few days after the wedding day. Were reportedly sent to bed with enough ceremony to fill a novel. The court watched them climb into bed together, then left the couple alone to begin what everyone assumed would be a long and fertile partnership. And then Arthur died 5 months into the marriage. He was gone, possibly from the sweating sickness, possibly tuberculosis. Suddenly, the grand plan unraveled. Catherine was left stranded in England. Her dowry, only partially paid, her future unclear, and her virginity under suspicious review. You see whether or not she and Arthur had actually consummated their marriage would become the hottest theological debate in Europe 2 decades later, but at the time it was just humiliating. Still, the dynastic wheels kept turning. Within a year, Henry VIII proposed a new plan. Catherine would marry Arthur's younger brother Henry, who would one day become that Henry. There was one little problem: marrying your dead husband's brother against church law. No big deal though, because Catherine swore up and down the marriage was never consummated, and Pope Julius II granted a papal dispensation. The wedding wouldn't happen until 1509, after Henry VIII died, and young athletic golden boy Henry VIII ascended the throne. And for a while it seemed like everything was going to be fine. Catherine was Queen of England, adored by the people, fluent in Latin, devoted to religion, and often more politically savvy than her husband. She even served as regent while Henry was off playing soldier in France, and managed to pull off a stunning victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. But beneath the pearls and courtly dances, the dynasty's foundation was already cracking. Catherine's pregnancies were a tragedy in slow motion. She was pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child, Mary, survived. The rest, boys and girls, were stillborn, died shortly after birth, or miscarried. The pressure was immense, and everyone wanted a male heir. Henry, once smitten, grew bitter and paranoid. The court started whispering Was the queen cursed? Was God punishing them? For the technically incestuous marriage, and here's where the genetics rear. Their well-documented, scientifically recognized head Catherine's own maternal grandparents were both from the Truss line, meaning her parents were not just cousins. They were part of a lineage that had looped in on itself for generations. Some researchers today believe that the repeated infant deaths may have stemmed from a genetic incompatibility between her and Henry, a hypothesis that involves what's called kilo immunization. If true, it would mean Catherine carried a blood antigen that caused her body to attack fetal red blood cells after the first successful pregnancy, a cruel twist of biology passed down from centuries of noble cousin matching. But back then, no one could name it. They just saw failure. And failure in a queen always ends badly. By 1525, Henry had fixated on, and Berlin Catherine was pushed aside, stripped of her titles, and confined. She refused to agree to an annulment, insisting she was Henry's lawful wife and queen. This wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. Catherine believed to the bitter end that her marriage had been wholly her role ordained by God, and her daughter Mary, the rightful heir. Her refusal sparked the English Reformation. Henry broke from the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and launched a religious war that would split England for generations, all because one queen wouldn't lie about a marriage. She'd been forced into, at 15, a quirky fact about Catherine: she was a total bookworm. Fluent in Latin and Spanish, she often translated religious texts and was a known patron of humanist scholars. Erasmus of Rotterdam, yes, that Erasmus once praised her intellect. And when she was confined at Kimbleton Castle in her final years, she reportedly spent her days in prayer, embroidery, and lettering. Writing her last letter to Henry, addressed him not as a tyrant or betrayer, but as my most dear lord and husband, which, yeah, that's either devotion on a saintly level or the final note in a lifetime of royal gaslighting. Scholars still argue whether Catherine's miscarriages were purely bad luck or symptoms of deeper genetic issues. But what's undeniable is how her life, like so many royal women, was shaped and ultimately shattered by a family tree too bent to stand straight. She was the product of dynasties that believed in the divine right of kings and the divine necessity of cousins, and in the end, all that purity of blood couldn't save her. Next, we'll meet Isabella of Portugal, Catherine's niece, and the empress who married her own double first cousin, producing a son whose chin and destiny would both go down in history. You find yourself now in a golden sunlit hall in Toledo, somewhere between the glow of power and summon and the long shadow of legacy tapestries rustle in a breeze that smells faintly of incense and dried roses. At the head of this hall stands a woman draped in regal silence, Isabella of Portugal. If Catherine of Aragon had the stubborn defiance of a queen wronged, Isabella has the heavy poise of one born knowing exactly what's expected and exactly how it's going to hurt, because Isabella didn't just marry a cousin, she married her double first cousin. That's a genetic term, yes, and a very real nightmare, especially when you're carrying the weight of two dynasties on your spine, and producing an heir becomes the one job you're not allowed to mess up. Let's pull apart that relationship for a moment. Isabella's father was King Manuel of Pierre-Sizet of Portugal. Her mother was Maria of Aragon, the sister of Catherine of Aragon. So Isabella was a product of both the Avis line of Portugal and the Trastamara line of Spain. two royal houses already deeply entangled through years of intermarriage. When she married Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the bloodline loop sealed tight. Charles wasn't just her cousin once over, he was her cousin twice from both sides of the family. You could practically hear their chromosomes groan when they exchanged vows, but in true imperial fashion, the marriage was pitched as a triumph. Charles V was the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time, ruling over not just Spain, but huge swaths of Italy, Germany, the Low Countries, and the Americas. And Isabella, she was the purest blood match available. Their wedding in 1526 was grand, even by Habsburg standards. Dancing, music, elaborate feasting, and political congratulations disguised as poetry. Historians have noted that Charles genuinely loved Isabella. In fact, he was unusually faithful by royal standards. He even missed her when he went off on his frequent imperial errands, which, let's be honest, is more than most kings of the period could say. Still, love doesn't undo DNA. Isabella and Charles had 7 children, but only 3 survived to adulthood. Among those was Philip II of Spain, yes, the gloomy Catholic king, who later married Mary Tudor and went on to make England very nervous. Philip would inherit not just his father's empire, but his mother's deeply saturated royal blood. And as with so many dynastic lineages, it showed but more on that soon. Isabella herself was described as intelligent, composed, and deeply pious. She was fluent in Latin and took her role as empress seriously. While Charles was away fighting Protestants or reorganizing his vast empire, Isabella served as regent in Spain, overseeing trade taxes, military provisioning, and all the other joys of early modern bureaucracy. Letters between her and Charles reveal an administrative partnership. As much as a romantic one, she wrote about provincial uprisings, grain prices, and the latest news from the Americas with all the precision of a modern chief of staff. But her reign wasn't all ledgers and letters behind the polished court surface. Isabella was plagued by anxiety and health issues like many women in her family. She suffered through multiple pregnancies, several of them ending in stillbirth. And though it's not documented in clinical language, because this was the 16th century, and everything got filed under melancholia, modern historians believe she showed signs of chronic depression, perhaps postpartum, or perhaps inherited from the same bloodlines that made her both a queen and a statistic. There's a particularly eerie moment preserved in court diaries. Isabella, pregnant with what would be her final child, fainted during a religious procession. It was a public event, and the crowd gasped as she collapsed pale and unconscious onto the stone steps of a cathedral. She never fully recovered. Less than a year later, in 1539, she died at the age of 36, the official. Cause was complications from childbirth, a vague term that could mean anything from hemorrhage to infection, to perhaps her body just giving out after too much strain, too many children, too much duty, too little rest. Charles was devastated. He wore black for the rest of his life. He commissioned portrait sculptures and even a grand tomb in her honor. But he didn't remarry for a man who ruled half the known world. That's saying something. He later retired to a monastery and took up clock-making, which feels very on brand for a man who'd spent his life trying to keep a ticking empire from falling apart. Here's the historical wild card. Isabella's bloodline, intensely inbred, meticulously preserved, produced Philip II, who then went on to marry his own niece and later his own cousin, the Loop. didn't just continue, it tightened. One scholar referred to Isabella and Charles's marriage as the turning point from strategy to surrender from that moment on. The Habsburgs were no longer just intermarrying to strengthen alliances. They were doing it because there were hardly any outsiders left who matched their standards of royal purity. Now here's the quirky twist. Despite the increasingly fragile bodies coming out of this genetic funnel, the Habsburgs kept winning. Empires expanded, gold flow from the America's enemies were crushed. There's a strange tension in Isabella's story between this visible triumph and invisible decline, between a court gilded with silver thread and a body breaking down from too much repetition in the gene code. Was Isabella aware of the danger? Probably not in the way we'd think about it today. Her letters mention illness, stillbirths, headaches, but never genetics. That wasn't a concept, yet the idea that marrying your cousin might doom your children to physical or mental frailty wouldn't enter common discourse until centuries later, and even then royals would ignore it. But the signs were there in the haunted eyes of her surviving son in the funeral she attended for infants who never drew breath in the silence that followed her own death, as the Spanish court wrapped itself in black and the empire she helped hold together quietly creaked under its own weight. Isabella of Portugal is often overshadowed by louder names, Catherine and Mary, even Charles. But her story is one of the clearest lenses through which you can view the cost of dynastic ambition. She was everything a queen was supposed to be: noble, obedient, fertile, and ultimately gone too soon. Next we shift focus north, where Margaret's legacy continues in the Low Countries, and a duchess named Maria of Burgundy tries to escape the trap. But the family tree has other plans. The light shifts, now grows cooler, softer, as we drift north from the sun-shed courts of Iberia to the lush, damp pastures of Burgundy, where silk banners flap in a colder breeze, and the halls are more Dutch than Spanish, more Flemish than Castilian. You find yourself in the Burgundian Netherlands, that rich, glittering corner of Europe that always seemed to lie just outside the reach of stability, and in the middle of it all, wrapped in furs and political anxiety, stands Marie of Burgundy. If you're hoping for a moment of calm in our parade of inbred royalty, well, not tonight. Marie is another noble woman tangled in the Habsburg web. And though she tries to claw her way out, fate and family have other plans. Marie was born in 1457, the only child of Charles, the bold Duke of Burgundy, and Isabella of Bourbon. Now her mother was the daughter of a Bourbon prince and a Valois princess, meaning Marie's family tree had already been bending in on itself like a drunk. Tried tie a necktie. Charles the Bold wanted son, of course he did. But when Marie arrived, he immediately began preparing her to rule. And not just symbolically, he raised her to read treaties, interpret military reports, and conduct court rituals with the weight of a sovereign. That was all well and good until he died suddenly in battle at Nancy in 1477, leaving 19-year-old Marie as ruler of one of the richest territories in Europe, and unmarried. Cue the political feeding frenzy. France, always circling Burgundy like a hungry wolf, moved fast. King Louis XI wanted Marie to marry his son and take Burgundy with her into French hands. The Low Countries weren't having it. They preferred the Habsburgs. Yes, those charming overlords of cousin marriages and imperial ambition. So the Burgundian nobles made their move. They offered Marie's hand to Maximilian of Austria, son of Emperor Frederick. 3. And yes, if that name sounds familiar, it should. That's the same Maximilian who was the son of Eleanor of Portugal and Frederick III, meaning, you guessed it, another round of cousin Notch just got added to the pile. Marie, to her credit, wasn't all that thrilled about the idea. She'd been educated to rule, not just to serve. She reportedly delayed the marriage negotiations, insisting on favorable terms, and in a rare medieval flex, she also issued the Great Privilege, a document that gave significant power to the local provinces in exchange for their support. That wasn't just politics, it was a rebellion against the centralized royal control that her suitors, especially the French and Habsburgs, preferred. But in the end, the dynastic machine, once she married Maximilian in 1477, and with that marriage, the Habsburg inherited the entire Bandian inheritance, a prize that would define European politics for the next century. Now, here's the part where the gene pool starts bubbling ominously. Marie and Maximilian were distant cousins connected through generations of Valois and Habsburg unions. Their children, therefore, were a perfect blend of French, Burgundian, Austrian, and Iberian royal blood, none of which had ever spent much time outside the family circle. Their son, Philip the Handsome, would later marry Joanna the Mad of Castile, which we've already covered in all its emotionally volatile glory. So yes, Marie of Burgundy is technically the great grandmother of Charles V and one of the key contributors to the now infamous Habsburg jaw, but Marie didn't live long enough to see what her bloodline would become. She died in 1482, just 5 years after her wedding, in a tragic horse riding accident. She was out hunting, a proper noble pastime, when her horse slipped on a muddy road and fell on top of her. Her back was crushed. She lingered in agony for several days before dying at the age of 25. The court went into mourning. Maximilian wept, and Europe once again found itself with a power vacuum shaped like a young woman. Here's the quirky detail: Marie was buried in Bruges, and her tomb remains one of the most visited sites in the city. But during a renovation in the 20th century, archaeologists opened the tomb and found her remarkably well-preserved skeleton, complete with a visible injury to the spine, exactly where chroniclers described her accident. It's one of those eerie moments where legend and osteology meet under fluorescent lighting. So what do scholars make of Marie's role in the genetic arc of Europe? Some view her as a pivotal figure, not just a dynastic match, but the critical hinge that swung the Bandian legacy toward the Habsburgs. Without Marie, there's no Charles F, no global empire, and possibly no grotesque accumulation of cousin-coded chromosomes. Others focus on her lost potential. As an educated, politically active young woman, she might have ruled Burgundy as an independent duchess, an alternative history, where the Low Countries become their own powerhouse instead of yet another Habsburg annex. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. Marie married the right man at the wrong time and died before she could shape her legacy, and that legacy ultimately became her descendants, long-faced, melancholic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes broken, but always bound to the throne by blood too thick to breathe freely. One final thought: Marie tried in her brief rule to decentralize power, to give voice to her people, and to resist the dynastic stranglehold of her time. But even her resistance became a tool of the empire. Her blood, her body, and her banner all ended up under Habsburg control. It's the ultimate medieval irony. the more she tried to escape the family knot, the tighter it pulled around her. Next, we head back into the heart of that knot and meet Anna of Austria, a woman who married her own nephew and somehow didn't even make the top 3 weirdest Habsburg unions. It's about to get darker. The air thickens as we travel now to late 16th century Spain, a time when candles flickered against stone walls already haunted by portraits with too many identical faces. Welcome to the court of Philip, where the inbreeding isn't just an unfortunate footnote, it's the main feature. And here, standing quietly in a velvet gown that probably weighed more than a grown dog, is Anna of Austria. She serenes, devout, obedient, exactly what the Spanish court wanted in a queen, but behind that placid mask is a truth so twisted you could use. It is a puzzle in a genetics class, because Anna didn't just marry her cousin, she married her uncle, her actual biological uncle. That's right, she was 17, he was her mother's brother, and their shared genes could have won a family reunion bingo game. In one turn, Anna of Austria was born in 1549, daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria of Spain. Maria, in turn, was the sister of Philip, the making Anna both his niece and, thanks to the Habsburgs' ongoing commitment to the family circle, already his cousin through multiple other lines. If you're trying to keep track, just imagine their family tree as a plate of spaghetti where every noodle touches every other noodle, and someone spilled holy oil on it at the time of their engagement. Philip II was already on his 4th marriage attempt. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, his double first cousin. Then came Mary I of England, also his cousin. Then Elizabeth of Valois, again a cousin. And now his teenage niece, Anna. By this point, the Habsburgs had stopped bothering to look outside the family. They'd seen what happened when bloodlines got too mixed, claims weakened, borders blurred, alliances frayed. Better to just keep it in the family, even if that family was starting to look like a set of nesting dolls with the same face their marriage took place. In 1570, Philip was 43, Anna was 17. The age gap was considered completely normal. What wasn't normal, even by 16th century standards, was how closely related they were. The Pope had to grant a special papal dispensation, one that raised more than a few eyebrows in Rome, but the political necessity overrode religious awkwardness. Philip needed a fertile wife to produce a male heir. His previous attempt hadn't gone well, and Anna came with the best breeding credentials possible: pure Habsburg blood, extreme piety, and a womb unburdened by other dynastic alliances. So how did this deeply incestuous union work out? Surprisingly, not terribly, at least in the short term. Anna was reportedly kind, patient, and genuinely liked her husband. He in turn seems to have adored her in his own somber, tightly wound way. Unlike his previous marriages, this one was relatively peaceful. No public arguments, no scandal. She played her role as queen perfectly reserved in public, devoutly Catholic, endlessly maternal. She gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession, 4 of whom survived infancy. Another Habsburg miracle. One of those children was Philip III of Spain, who would eventually succeed his father. But while Anna herself seemed to weather the biological risks of close-in breeding better than some of her predecessors, the genetic toll was quietly acre-wing in her children. Philip III, her most famous son, grew up listless, indecisive, and deeply reliant on court favorites to govern. While not physically deformed like his own son, would later be many scholars note the intellectual and emotional decline that began with this generation. He was smart enough to stay out of wars, but too passive to lead. An empire, his reliance on court favorites like the Duke of Lerma led to widespread corruption and the slow decline of Spanish global influence. It was the beginning of a quiet unraveling, and Anna's genes were part of the recipe. Here's a fringe medical fact. Some researchers believe that the accumulation of recessive genes from repeated uncle-niece marriages in the Habsburg line contributed to something called mandibular prognathism, aka the infamous Habsburg jaw, and his children showed early signs of this condition, but it would fully blossom in her grandson, Charles II, whose jaw was so oversized he couldn't chew food properly. That's where we're heading for Anna. She was still in the early stages of the Habsburg decline, symptoms beginning to appear, but not yet catastrophic. She died in 1580, just shy of her 31st birthday. The cause complication from childbirth, which given the rate at which she was expected to produce heirs, is hardly surprising. Philip was devastated for a man so. Emotionally buttoned up, his grief was palpable. He reportedly locked himself away for weeks, wore mourning clothes for the rest of his life, and never remarried. Some even say he kept her portrait beside him at all times, whispering prayers into the canvas, a tragically romantic detail, or a sign that the man had finally realized what his dynasty had cost him. A quirky footnote: Anna was obsessed with relics and holy tokens. She collected saints' bones, fragments of robes, and splinters of what was supposedly the true crosser. Private chapel looked less like a royal sanctuary and more like a medieval medical museum. Was it a symptom of her devout upbringing, or maybe just a coping mechanism for a life that required daily denial of personal choice? Historians today still debate whether Anna knew the full scope of her genetic connection to Philip when she married him. It's hard to believe she didn't. But then again, in her world, marrying your uncle wasn't scandalous. It was practical. It meant staying within the Habsburg brand, keeping outsiders out, and in ensuring the purity of the royal line, a purity that came at the cost of physical health, mental acuity. And for many women like Anna, their lives, she wasn't flamboyant or rebellious or particularly outspoken, but Anna of Austria might just be the most quietly dangerous woman in this entire dynasty, because from her womb came a generation that looked perfect on paper and hollow beneath the surface. Next up, we meet Hannah of Austria, Anna's sister-in-law, and one of the rare royal women who actually ruled in her own name, but even she couldn't outrun the family shadow or its genes. You wake up now in a Spanish court wrapped in somber elegance, black silks, ivory beads, and incense-soaked corridors where politics and piety dance in practiced silence. Here walks Hannah of Austria, tall, composed, and brilliant. She glides through the halls like someone raised not only among royalty, but as royalty, the kind of woman who bows to no one unless the optics require it, unlike many of her predecessors. Hannah isn't just another dynastic pawn shuffled into marriage and early death. She's something rarer, a Habsburg woman trusted to rule. But don't let that fool you into thinking she escaped the family curse. Her pedigree is as pure and as twisted as a pretzel dipped in holy water. Born in 1535, Juana was the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Yes, those two, the double first cousins from Section 8. So right from birth or bloodline, was tighter than a sealed tomb, but physically. Hannah seemed to dodge the worst of the Habsburg deformities now. Jawbone, you could hang a curtain rod from, no reported limp, no debilitating disease. Instead, she inherited her father's cool intellect and her mother's quiet strength that said when both your parents are from the same set of grandparents twice over, you don't exactly get a clean slate. You get a loaded dice roll. Her childhood was cloaked in velvet and protocol. She was raised alongside her brother Philip Zeck and a rotating cast of aunts, tutors, and religious advisors who filled her head with languages, theology, and statecraft. She spoke Latin, French, and Castilian fluently by her teens, and could hold her own in debates with Bishop Erasmus. If he'd still been alive, would have given her a slow clap. Now here's where her story veers off the usual track. At just 17, Juana was married to Prince Joel Manuel of Portugal, her first cousin, not just your run-of-the-mill cousin. Either this was a solid intermarriage between two dynasties that had already been trading genes like medieval Pokemon cards. Joel's health wasn't great. He had that ghostly glow you only get from generations of not-so-genetic diversity, and sure enough, less than 2 years into the marriage, he died of what's generally believed to be tuberculosis or some other inbred immunity failure. Hannah was left a widow at 19. But wait, it gets better. She was also pregnant. The child, a boy, was born shortly after Joe's death and named Sebastian. He would later become king of Portugal. And if you're imagining a strong viral monarch